Now, the United States is in a deep financial crisis that has gone on for more than 2 years. It began with the failure of some of the biggest financial institutions in the country. Some of those failures amidst charges of corruption and mismanagement of funds at the highest level. Banks have failed in record numbers, small banks as well as large banks. Major national companies, which for years have been productive, are facing bankruptcy. Hundreds and even thousands of Americans have seen their retirement vanish. The stock market has plunged 66% in 2 years. The country also, amidst this financial situation, finds itself in a global economic crisis. The value of the dollar has plunged. European investors are taking their money out of the United States. There is a depressed market for major goods from the United States. And amidst all of this financial trouble, the country is deeply divided. It is divided along geographical lines and over fundamental moral issues. And along with all of this, it is a presidential year. And an unknown attorney from Illinois is one of the leading candidates. And though he makes very fine speeches, he is deeply distrusted by a major portion of the country who say, listen to what he is saying. He is proposing the most profound transformation in our country's history. Now, am I talking about the year 2008? I'm talking about the year 1860. And that candidate, of course, is Abraham Lincoln. And since 1857, this country has been in a severe economic recession. And people are thinking about their pocketbooks. And that is what they will vote when they go to the polls. But it is a deeply divided nation. And both sides appeal to the founders. That is like 2008, when both sides appeal to the intentions of the founders. And that's what we are here to talk about tonight. In our first lecture, we talked about our national freedom. And what is a testament to our national freedom? The Declaration of Independence. And what does the Declaration of Independence make us? The only nation in history founded upon what? Moral principles. But that independence would have remained futile unless its freedom was embodied in the Constitution. And last hour, we talked about the miracle at Philadelphia. How in one summer, 55 delegates worked to give a constitution to their fellow citizens, for their fellow citizens to consider and to ratify. Can our Congress do that much in one summer? Can they do it in 2 years? No. And besides, you'd be terrified of what they came up with, wouldn't you? But that Constitution went out to Americans. And all through the 13 states, it was debated in specially called conventions chosen by the people, because those men at Philadelphia wanted it to have as broad a base of popular support as possible. So you picture yourself there at one of those ratifying conventions, New Hampshire or Georgia, Virginia or New York. And in ordinary town meetings all over the country, because it wasn't just the politicians who went to the conventions, it was ordinary men and women who discussed this Constitution and what did it mean. Now, how many of the same men signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? Only 6. So there are great patriots like Patrick Henry speaking out at ratifying conventions, telling you that there never was an instrument more fiendishly devised to rob a free people of their liberty than this Constitution. Samuel Adams will have nothing to do with it. They're in Massachusetts. So it is a hotly contested Constitution. And what does it say? Because whenever we appeal back to the intentions of the founders, if we're there in the ratifying convention or if we're in a polling booth here this coming fall, what were the intentions of the founders? Where do they tell you what their intentions were? In the preamble, correct? That's where it tells you what their intentions are. And what are their intentions? How does the preamble go? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States. What's your name? Well, that's just excellent. Absolutely excellent. So, we the people. Now that gives us our first principle of the Constitution. It rests upon the consent of the governed. We the people of the United States. Now, as late as September the 5th, the preamble read, we the people of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, Georgia, right on down. We the people of these states. And one of the things Patrick Henry immediately said when he saw the Constitution was, how dare they speak the language of the people? This is a confederation of states. But we the people, that is how it came down to us. We the people of the United States. And all through the Constitution and all through the Bill of Rights, if you remember one thing, remember this. What does people mean? How is it defined? Well, you just said it to me very nicely. How is it defined? It means the individuals. The people is always used to mean the individuals. Now, there's another way to use it, of a collective whole. And when Adolf Hitler spoke about the people of Germany, das Volk, he did not mean the individuals. He meant a very different concept of democracy, in which the general will is swept up through one great leader. And you do not get the general will by counting a majority vote. That's not what we said. That was what the French Revolution said, and they ended up with Napoleon. We said every individual counts. So we the people means we the individuals of the United States. And the last word in the Bill of Rights, as we shall see next time, is the people. The founders put it on you. And that is where the burden still remains, on you, the individual, to maintain this Constitution. So consent of the governed is the most fundamental principle. Then the rule of law. This Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. So we are a government of laws, not of arbitrary men and women. And because they set, the founders did, this Constitution up as the law, when you're sworn into the army, what do you promise to do? Defend the Constitution. What does the president promise to do? Defend the Constitution. The Constitution is our law. And the founders, like me, had a pessimistic view of human nature. People tend to be evil. So you need a government of laws so that even the worst president, the worst Congress cannot do too much damage as long as you are true to that Constitution. And that is what has always preserved our country. Now, I know people worry about civic illiteracy in this country, people not knowing what's in the Constitution. Actually, I find my students have a pretty good idea of what's in the Constitution, and I never worry too much about that. The boys who waded ashore at Guadalcanal probably would have failed a test on the Constitution, don't you think? Boys who fought at Gettysburg on both sides. Well, one, they wouldn't have let you give them a test, but if they had, I don't know how well they would have done, but they believed in that Constitution, and that is what Americans have done. So the rule of law as embodied in the Constitution, that is its second great principle. And then third, the separation of powers and checks and balances between powers. That is the genius of the founders. They understood power, and they understood it from their careful study of ancient Rome. They understood that power is necessary to achieve any good thing. The problem with the Articles of Confederation was it had no power. So they set out to establish a strong national government. But power, one of them said, is like a river. If you channel it, build canals, it irrigates and makes a land flourish. If it is unchecked, it rushes and sweeps everything before it. So power must be channeled. It must be balanced. And so the first three articles set up a separation of power, unique in the world's history and unique in the way that it has lasted, between the legislative branch, the president, and the judiciary. And the fact that we just take this for granted should never make us immune to how miraculously it has worked. Britain in 1787 had a balanced constitution that served as one of the models for ours. In fact, Alexander Hamilton believed it was the best constitution in the world. But the president was the king, and he has no, or she has no powers at all right now. The House of Lords has no powers. There is no independent judiciary. So Britain, in 1945, after Winston Churchill left office, could in 3 years become a social welfare state. There is no check upon the power of Parliament whatsoever, and that could have happened in this country. But we have kept that balance. But the founders also understood that there has to be a supreme power. And what is the supreme power in our Constitution as our founders intended it? What is the first article about? Congress. And if you look at the powers of Congress, they are sweeping. And those who oppose the Constitution, men like Patrick Henry, Edmund Randolph, George Mason of Virginia, Samuel Adams, they all pointed to the sweeping power of Congress, unfettered to regulate commerce, unfettered to tax, to establish tariffs, unfettered in terms of borrowing, unfettered in their war powers. Congress declares the war. The militias of the individual states are disciplined under the rules of Congress. Congress is a powerful force, economically, militarily, politically. Congress can impeach a president, and the Senate can remove him from office. Can the president impeach a congressman? No. And to repeat, the veto. The president can veto. Can Congress override him? So Congress is meant to be the supreme power. But that's an enormous power. So it's balanced, first of all, by having a Congress and a Senate, a House of Representatives and a Senate. And they, in the old Constitution, in the intent of the founders, were fundamentally different. How often is the House of Representatives member elected? 2. Every 2 years. And they were supposed to represent no more than 30,000 people. Now that's pretty close. and you went back to home in Cincinnati, Ohio, you had people come right up to you at the grocery store and tell you, I don't like what you're doing, and I'm not voting for you anymore. Who do you think you are? Well, now how many people do how many constituents does an ordinary congressman represent? About 560,000, something like that. You don't find many of them shopping at the Walmart either, do you? Though they might get some common sense if they did. So the Congress was supposed to be very much your instrument. And every 2 years, you just turned them out. The founders thought about term limits. And they said, no, that is shirking our responsibility. The ordinary citizen ought to be able to say, I'm the term limit and you're gone. And Congress was responsible for generating bills of finance. And the Senate was different. How long does a senator still serve? 6 years. And in the Constitution, as the founders intended it, and as it was down until 1913, a senator was appointed by the state legislators. Why? Well, that's one good reason, yes. And two, we'll come back to his point, and two, because the founders believed in democracy. They said, we the people, but they knew that democracy running rampant would destroy freedom. So the senators are indirectly elected. You vote for your state legislator, he then appoints the senator, and senators serve for 6 years. And their main task is foreign policy. That's where you need continuity. In domestic policy, the founders said, listen to the people all the time. But they knew that the great democracy of Athens had failed because the people tried to run foreign policy. And Rome had succeeded because the Senate was indirectly elected, served for life. You need that continuity and expertise in foreign policy. You cannot have a system, as we do, in which 1 year you're all excited about a war in Iraq, and a year later a public opinion poll is taken and you say, oh no, we don't want it anymore, and you change. It is essential to have continuity in foreign policy. Tell me, do any of you remember Gene McCarthy? Yes or no? You're all too young, aren't you? But I remember him as a boy. And he said we should go back to the state legislatures appointing senators, because there ought to be one branch of the legislature that is not constantly out looking for campaign contributions. So that is what they intended. And the House of Representatives and the Senate, chosen in these different ways for these different terms with these different goals, check and balance one another superbly. And then, as you said, also because of the importance of the states. And along with checks and balances and separation of powers goes federalism. And the states are built into every element of our Constitution. How many votes does each state have in the Senate? 2. So that makes Delaware just as important as New York. And the Electoral College. How is a president elected? By the states, correct? Through the electoral vote. So the states are a fundamental check in the mind of the founders upon an all-powerful national government. And whenever anyone in these ratifying conventions said, this government you're creating is going to be a centralized despotism, taxing as much as it wants, prying into every aspect of the individual's life. And the answer to that was no. The states will prevent it. And that is one of the greatest ways in which we have drifted away from the principles of the founders, is to allow the states to erode their own powers. And what has been time after time the reason why states have given up their essential rights? Money, federal money. But the states and states' rights were essential to the founders' view of a balanced Constitution. So what are our principles so far? Who's actually writing down what I say? I'm not text messaging. What are they? Consent of the governed, rule of law, separation of power and checks and balances, and states' rights, or let us call it federalism. How do you define federalism? It's a system of government in which there are two powers, in this case the state and the national government. In some areas, the national government has absolute power. What is it? Declare war. Could we declare war on Texas on our own? No. And what is an absolute right of the state? I'm going to give you something you haven't thought about. You'll get mad about. Education. Under the Constitution, if you read it, it says, in order to further arts and sciences and letters, Congress shall have the right to issue patents and copyrights. This is the founders very clearly specifying that the federal government has no other role in education. They knew all about federal funding for education, and they thought it would lead to citizens trained only to be obedient servants of a despotic government. They said the state should control the values and education that their citizens learned. So that is an absolute power of the state that we've given away. And then, unfortunately, what is a concurrent power? One that both the federal government and the states have. Taxes, yes. Everybody can tax you. Tax, 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 of course. So that is a concurrent power. So federalism is fundamental to the Constitution and the intent of the founders that the states remain strong. Then there is the principle of change. The founders knew they were not perfect. They knew that they were very flawed individuals. And they knew this country would grow and prosper. And so they put in the 5th article about how to amend the Constitution. It's a difficult process. Changes should be made with great care and great support, but it is there. And that is why this Constitution still gives us freedom, if we will take it, in this totally different world when we are a superpower and a global economy. The principle of change. The 10 Commandments. What did God put into the 10 Commandments to enable them to be changed? I'm asking you. What is the amending process for the 10 Commandments? There is none. And the greatest statesmen of the ancient world, men like Solon of Athens, whose image is there in the House of Representatives today as one of the greatest lawgivers of all times. He gave the people of Athens a new constitution, then he left for 10 years so nobody could even question him about it. And it was forbidden by death to propose any changes. We have never said that, and to prove it, the founders in their first Congress amended it 10 times. So the principle of change and the principle of secularism. How many times is God mentioned in the, or called upon, let's use a stronger term, called upon in the Declaration of Independence? 4. Did you get that right? 4. In the Constitution, how many times does God appear? 0. Not even the oath of the president has "so help me God." They were believing men. And they, as they said in the first Congress, believed that religion and morality were essential to freedom. But this was a government of men and ultimately women, and it had to work on its own accord. So the principle of secularism. So these are our great principles of this Constitution. Consent of the governed. What else? Repeat them after me. The consent of the government. We the people. We are a democracy. A balanced democracy based upon a constitution, which is the rule of law. The separation of powers, the checks and balances, that is what has maintained that rule of law. And then what? Federalism, the rights of the states, the principle of change, and secularism. This is a government of men and women, not divinely imposed, and this then carries with it the responsibility. You can't blame God. You see what I mean? You could blame God for King George since he claimed to be king by the grace of God. But you're the ones who are responsible for this mess. And so this Constitution went out, and it was debated. We saw last time that it called forth a body of intellectual thought about politics as great as ancient Greece, equal to Plato and Aristotle. On both sides, great patriots debated these issues. And then they voted. The conventions voted. What was the first state to ratify this Constitution? Brave little Delaware. This is the best deal they were ever going to get. I mean, why that little dinky state should have the same rights as we do, I don't know. December the 7th, 1787. And New Jersey, another dinky little state, came after it fast. Georgia, which was a big state but had a very small population, it went in early. But Virginia, New York, that's where the serious debates occurred. And it was to sway public opinion in New York that James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay began writing the work that would be called The Federalist, based upon 85 newspaper articles, carefully going through and explaining these principles of the Constitution and why it would work and why it would enhance freedom, not destroy it. New York was a very hard sell. Virginia was a hard sell. But how the next principle, the final principle we might just put in there, is practicality. This is a very practical Constitution. It's very flexible. And part of the practicality at the very beginning was, how many states did it take to put this Constitution into effect for those states? 9. That's practical. And it got on towards who was going to be 9th. Virginia sort of hastened along and said, okay, we don't like much about this Constitution. We ought to be a great country by ourselves, but all right, we'll be the 9th. They got word New Hampshire had beaten into it. But they limped on in. North Carolina was a little more wary of what you expressed so boldly last time. They were a little wary that politicians would give them a Bill of Rights. So they hesitated. And Rhode Island had to be forced in by an embargo. They really wanted that cheap money and debt. So they had to be forced in by a trade embargo. But they all came under the new Rufus, it was called. But the question still remained. And those who had grudgingly voted for the ratification, those who remained opposed to it, all asked, will this thing work? Show us another Constitution that is working right now. This is such a complicated machine. All these checks and balances. A very undefined role for the commander-in-chief. And we're not sure what this judiciary can do. It has enormous potential power to try all cases that might arise in law and equity, all aspects. So the real test would be what that first Congress did. And if that was a Congress that spent its time posturing before the press, if that was the Congress that thought about getting reelected from the day they took office and went out looking for campaign contributions, we wouldn't be here tonight in freedom. No, they took their task seriously. They understood that they had this meeting with destiny. 16 members of that first Constitutional Congress, the first to meet under the Constitution, 16 members of them were among the 39 who signed that Constitution. And so they came, and they began to meet. And first, and we'll go into this in more detail next time, They got all the states to submit whatever recommendations they wanted for a Bill of Rights. And they got that done in that one term. Can you imagine how long it would take to get a Bill of Rights done today with all the competing vested interests? They had it done. But they had other big tasks. The Northwest Territory, the Northwest lands. Remember how we outsmarted the British and French and Spanish diplomats and got an empire that stretched out to the Mississippi, but almost nobody lived there. And how was it going to be governed? Now, the wise heads of Europe, as always misunderstanding us, thought we would turn it into a colonial empire, that we would rule it the way the British ruled Canada and Australia. Now, Canada's a nice country, and don't get mad at me, but it has never amounted to anything. It is a huge country, bigger than ours. And don't say because it's cold. You know, it's cold up in Minnesota too. But we have Minneapolis. It is an arid desert in a place that's now called Phoenix. No. But being under the mother country all those years, did you know in 1914, Canada was just informed that they were at war with Germany? Now, being under the mother country has turned them into a nation that wants health care and everything taken care of for them. And so it was thought we would control the Northwest Territory, use it, get their raw goods, use them for our factories in the 13 states. No. Instead, this Northwest Ordinance, drafted and put into effect by that same first Congress, set the precedent that all the states will be equal. And so out of that would grow Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, part of Minnesota. And that Congress also showed that it was strong. Now, they had to compromise, remember, with the South about slavery. But when it came to the Northwest Ordinance, it boldly proclaimed that that vast territory, in that territory, slavery would be forever forbidden. And so in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was being asked by Southern sympathizers, how dare you interfere with slavery in the territories? The founders never would have approved of that. He said, well, I guess they did. 16 of them signed it, showing the power of the federal government to prevent slavery. And then, you ever heard of a wall between church and state? You ever heard you can't say a prayer, like the Lord's Prayer, in school, yes or no? I don't know, I'm asking you, yes or no? The Northwest Ordinance says, liberty is founded upon education, morality, and religion, and they must be forever encouraged. Liberty, religion, morality, and education must be forever encouraged and entwined. So that first Congress came forth with a bold plan of freedom for that vast land. And you know, when the struggle for the Union came, nobody paid more bravely and paid a greater sacrifice than those men from the old Northwest that had come into the Union under states like Indiana and Illinois, suffering the highest per capita losses during the Civil War. A great empire of freedom. So now we've got a Bill of Rights that every day protects you, correct? When I drive home tonight, I pass through Newcastle and I'm arrested for speeding. Can they take me off to the Newcastle jail and you'll never hear of me again? They probably could because of my luck with lawyers, but I'm supposed to have the right of habeas corpus. Can they hang, draw, and quarter me there in Newcastle? No, that's cruel and unusual punishment, correct? That still protects you every day. So a Bill of Rights, a Northwest Ordinance. Now that's not an extraordinary achievement, but what brought us here last week? A debt and mortgage crisis. That's why we came to Philadelphia.
Articles of Confederation might have drifted on for years, except we were hurt in the pocketbook. And we had a national debt of $73 million, which, adjusted for inflation, is just about our national debt today that we can't pay off. What were we going to do about the financial system of this country? Its currency was worthless, foreclosures, debt, and a credit rating that was the laughingstock of the world. How are you ever going to become a prosperous democracy? And again, the founders knew from their study of the ancient world that what really destroys democracy is lack of prosperity for the ordinary citizen. So what were they going to do? And that was the task that George Washington set for Alexander Hamilton. And I told you this last time, the cabinet of George Washington consisted of Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury. Now, wouldn't you give something to have those two in place today? But they had very different views. And from the beginning of our Constitution, there have been two views that are still with us today, and I bet you we could get a division in this House as well. Should you have a broad construction of that Constitution or a narrow one? Should you have a strong national government, or should you have a very limited national government? Should you have a government that can tax as much as it wants, or do you want to keep taxes low? Now, you like to think of Thomas Jefferson as a liberal. He was not. He was our first great conservative. That government is best that governs least. Don't tax unless it is absolutely necessary. And the Constitution should be interpreted as narrowly as possible. Congress has the right to establish post roads. What does that mean? Asked Jefferson. It means it can say that road running out there, built by a private contractor, can carry the mail. That's all. Alexander Hamilton would say absolutely not. It means that Congress can, by taxes, fund a huge program of public works and an interstate highway. Congress has the right to establish post offices. Thomas Jefferson would say that means they can tell you in your grocery store that you've got to sell stamps and take the mail. And Alexander Hamilton would say, no, it means you can build a huge complex of government buildings. So that narrow versus the broad construction. And Hamilton was not a native of any state. Very great man. Born an illegitimate son, but educated by his father. Born in the West Indies, came and studied in New York at what was then King's College, became Columbia University. And he took a broad national view. In fact, if he could have, he'd have gotten rid of all the states. And he had a belief in a strong national government. And George Washington shared that belief. And in fact, as Washington's term went on and the second term came about, Thomas Jefferson in 1793 would resign as Secretary of State because he realized that Washington was going with Hamilton in building a national government that was far too strong for the taste of Thomas Jefferson. And part of that strength had to be financial. So Hamilton had the task of coming up with a policy that would settle this debt. And the question about the powers of the president, Washington did not intend to be a figurehead. He let congressmen know what he wanted, and he wanted this debt settled. So $73 million, just about like our debt today, divided into three parts. Debts owed to foreign governments, incurred by the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War. Debts owed to individual merchants, incurred by the Continental Congress during the war to buy food and powder and weapons. And then debts incurred by the individual states to individual merchants during the war. Step one, the debts owed to foreign countries, to Holland and to France, who had paid for our revolution. There was never doubt about paying those off in gold and silver. Why? Those were debts of honor. Didn't they say our sacred honor in the Declaration of Independence? Those were debts of honor. Now, many another country has not paid back his debts. Tsarist Russia, when it fell, the Bolsheviks just canceled all the debts. You think you can get the debt owed to the Chinese emperor from China today? Go try to collect it. At World War I, we loaned all these countries money. Who's the only one that repaid us? Finland. All the rest wouldn't pay us back. Baffling President Coolidge, who said they borrowed the money, didn't they? No. So, but for us, it was a debt of honor. But then, these debts incurred by the Continental Congress to individual merchants, they amounted to a huge sum, and you had originally borrowed the money, but he had then bought your debt. So what you'd paid $100 for, he'd paid a penny for, because you didn't ever think you were going to collect, right, from this moribund collapsing Confederate Articles of Confederation. So he had paid 1 cent for a $100 bond. And then Congress has said we cannot reward speculators like Rich. We just won't. Well, Hamilton forcefully argued. I'm not saying it's morally right to make him rich, but it's financially sound. Because the next person who gives us a bond for $100 or buys a savings bond for $100, they're going to be confident they get paid. And so, finally, Congress agreed to make you rich. And those debts were paid at full value. But then came these ones incurred by the states individually. States like South Carolina and Massachusetts, spendthrifts, rebels and Confederates alike could not manage their finances, and they had huge debts. Virginia had been very cautious and paid off its debt. And the delegates from Virginia said in this first Congress, look, we are not going to pay off and bail out South Carolina and Massachusetts. Let them go down the tube. We don't care. We're not using federal money and paying any portion of it to bail out these really spendthrift states. So that was impossible. And Hamilton had to go to George Washington and say, we're not going to get that done. But that is the key to establishing a sound currency, you told me. I know, but I don't see how we're going to get it done. But Thomas Jefferson has not yet resigned. He's still a member of the cabinet. Get Jefferson in here, Jefferson the Virginian. All right, Hamilton, Jefferson, you're going to settle this before the afternoon is out. Walk up and down where I can see you and get this settled. And Jefferson said, Virginia's never going to go along with this. And Hamilton said, well, what if I could promise you that the new federal capital we're going to build in Philadelphia, well, I could promise you it's going to be built along the Potomac. What? Will Virginia go for it if we build it along the Potomac? I don't know. What about Philadelphia? They're probably going to be upset. Robert Morris, the most influential congressman from Pennsylvania, wants these debts paid. He'll swing the votes. So there it was, political deal. Can you imagine what CNN would do with it today? But it got done and it still works. Those debts were paid off. And then as a fourth element in this, a national bank was created. 1/4 of it was funded by the federal government, 3/4 by private investors who ended up getting 8%. Now that's not a bad return, is it? And it issued a sound currency based on the Spanish silver dollar. So the debts were paid, a sound currency established, at a national bank to handle the transactions of this emerging nation. And all of this done in that one congressional term. And in 1789, a great revolution broke out in France, the most prosperous and educated country in the world. And suddenly, European investors had no place to put their money except this new country, which had proven itself to be financially sound and to pay its debt. And so the funds began to roll into America from Europe, funding a century of prosperity. Now that's what a Congress can do. And guiding it all through those first crucial years was the truest, greatest American, George Washington. Forceful, implementing every element of that Constitution, commanding respect. And again, the wise heads of Europe all said, as 1796 began to turn towards 1797, of course, since there's no term limit, he will extend his power and become Lord Protector of the United States, like Oliver Cromwell. Actually, that was one of the titles suggested for him. His Highness, the President of the United States and Protector of the Rights of the United States. And Washington just said, call me Mr. President, please. He won't step down. And then on September the 16th in Philadelphia, you went out and you picked up your newspaper, Philadelphia Gazette. There was a letter in it from President Washington. And it read, I'm writing this to tell you that I will not run for a third term. I deeply appreciate all of those who think I am worthy of such a third term. I deeply appreciate and move more than I can say by the honors my countrymen have given me. But I've served 2 terms. That is enough for any man. I will retire. No person is indispensable. I would stop here, except the gracious kindness you have shown me all these years leads me to offer you a few words of advice. Never have political parties. Partisan politics will destroy your freedom faster than anything. The next thing that will destroy it is debt. Pay your debts and never be a debtor nation. And third, all be Americans. We have the greatest providence in the world. We speak one language. We share a common devotion to freedom. Do not think of yourself as a Georgia man or a Massachusetts man. Think of yourself always and only as an American. With every nation be a good neighbor. Make no entangling alliances. Do not allow yourself to be drawn into other people's troubles. And now I bid you an affectionate adieu. He went off for several weeks to Mount Vernon. Can you imagine how a president today would handle this with a press conference and all of that? No, just a simple letter. And then he stepped down. And the tradition was set that under this rule of law, no president would become a tyrant. He went back to Mount Vernon absolutely worn out. But visitors came from all over Europe, and one Englishman, one former enemy, was there and wrote back home. I was allowed to spend 3 days with General Washington. He wears his hair tied straight back like an ordinary soldier. There is nothing of the display about him. But I thought him the greatest man of our age. There was a French sculptor, Washington was greatly admired in France, who kept following Washington around Mount Vernon, trying to get just the right image to make a portrait of Washington. And he finally got it. Washington was going to buy a horse from this man, and this man suddenly changed the price he had promised. And Washington went, and that sculpture captured that reaction to this dishonor. And there he was, ill, the doctors giving him worse medical care than they would a Roman gladiator 1,700 years before, bleeding him. And until finally he turned and said, please, let me go, and died. When he died, a few weeks later, Britain and France were at war, and they were about to go into a great naval battle. And as the fleets began to engage each other, suddenly the French fleet hauled down its flags. And the British flashed over. What has happened? And the French flashed back. General Washington is dead. And the British then lowered their flags. And for 1 hour, both paid tribute to this greatest American. Well, thank you. I'm done.
Well, it's my great pleasure to be here again, and it's been very special coming to know the Oklahoma Christian University. It is a most remarkable institution with the most profound values, and two of my proudest awards are one to be the David and Ann Brown Distinguished Fellow with OCPA, and the other is to be the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair in the History of Freedom. And that really changed my life, receiving that chair. It allowed me to teach what I wanted to and to follow this mission of teaching about freedom. And now I'd like to add to that being associated with Oklahoma Christian University and all the goodwill that they have shown in sponsoring this event. Now, what is our theme? What have we been talking about? We've been talking about the unique course of the United States, that America is unique. And as the founders believed, it had been chosen by God to bear the ark of the liberty to the world. And we have achieved in this country a unique blend of the three fundamental concepts of freedom. What are they? We defined them in our first lecture. National freedom, political freedom. Who said they've been here every time? Now raise your hand, I won't call on you. All right, what are the three? National freedom. Good, good, very good. Now how do we define national freedom? It is freedom from foreign domination. We are so free, we cannot imagine being conquered by a foreign power. France can't say that, can they? No. Germany can't say that. And political freedom. Your freedom to vote. I don't get upset when not many people vote. That shows they take it for granted, which means that's how secure they are in their political freedom. And finally, you are more free to live here as you choose than anywhere else in the world. Are millions of people crossing the Black Sea every year to live in the Ukraine? Do millions cross into our country every year? Why? They care about their individual freedom. That is why they are coming. So we have achieved a unique blend of those three freedoms, unparalleled in history and not existing anywhere else in the world today. So that's the first lesson that we have learned. And the Civil War was essentially our great struggle over those three values. That's why it and the Revolutionary War are the critical moments in our country's history. Both the South and the North were fighting for national freedom. It was the war for Southern independence, and it was the war to preserve the Union as the foundation of our national freedom. Then political freedom. Both were fighting for democracy. And finally, it was individual freedom. Was the right to own slaves a fundamental part of your freedom, or was it a moral wrong that needed to be removed? Now, the second lesson that we have learned is throughout our country's history, we have moved towards freedom. But there have been two not competing, but complementary ideas about that freedom. One is that freedom is best secured by a limited government with low taxes. And the other is that freedom is best secured by a strong national government that must of necessity tax. That is as real today as it was in 1776. The American Revolution was a revolution for limited government and low taxes. Our Declaration of Independence begins with the evocation of the words that all men are created equal, and governments exist to ensure those fundamental rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But then follows a series of indictments against King George for having violated these fundamental rights. And they basically say he wants to establish a strong, centralized government, and he wants to tax us. So it was a revolution for limited government and low taxes. The American Constitution was a reaction. And the American Constitution is a strong national government with essentially unlimited power to tax, unlimited power to regulate commerce. And from the very beginning, our country has had two political parties, whatever their names, that defended one of those two ideas of freedom. George Washington, John Marshall, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, these great figures, were the Federalists. And their idea was a strong national government, a sound currency, and taxes. And Thomas Jefferson represented the Republicans, later to become the Democrats, whose idea was states' rights, very low taxes, and that government is best that governs least. And that has gone all the way through our country's history. And as the thoughtful Americans of 1787 and 1788 discussed this Constitution and whether or not to ratify it, there was another reaction. And it was towards the idea that this Constitution is too powerful. It is too big of a threat to our individual freedom. And we want some more regulations to limit government and its ability to interfere with our private lives and with our incomes. And therefore came the Bill of Rights. Remember, state after state ratified the Constitution on what condition? The verbal promise that the first Congress would present a Bill of Rights as a set of amendments to this new Constitution. And they did that in the first Congress along with what? The Northwest Ordinance, celebrating the great states like Ohio and Indiana and Minnesota. And what else did they do? They solved the debt and mortgage crisis. One Congress did all of those things. So the Bill of Rights, it is still the charter of our individual freedom. The charter of our national freedom is what? No, the charter of our national freedom is Declaration of Independence. We're going to have a study session after this. You have to come in and show me your notes. The Declaration of Independence is the charter of our national freedom. And remember, we're the only nation in history founded on moral principles. Then what is the charter of our political freedom? The Constitution. And the Bill of Rights is the charter of our individual freedom. How many amendments were in the Bill of Rights? Well, yes, but it came out 10. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Name me another set of laws that is 10. 10 commandments. And this should be the 10 commandments of our individual freedom. However, remember also that fundamental to this division in our idea of democracy is the idea of Thomas Jefferson that the Constitution must be very narrowly construed. It means exactly what it says. And the view of Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, the great John Marshall, that it should be construed very, very broadly. So still today, the Bill of Rights is at the center of our controversy about the degree to which the Constitution can be shaped to reflect today's values and the degree to which it should reflect the intent of the founders. Now, what is the first article of the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment? Say it proudly. Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech and of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, to petition, to present a petition of their grievances. Now, it is not an accident that that is the First Amendment. James Madison and his committee didn't just kind of shuffle them up and pick them out of a hat. That is the most basic freedom that you have. And it goes right back to Greece and Rome. And in Roman law, it was proclaimed that all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator with the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this was the fulfillment of the teachings of the school called the Stoics. The Stoics. Who's ever heard of it? Where does it come from? Porch, that's right. They didn't have fancy offices, did they? They just taught out in the open, under a porch. But they grew up in the years after Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great had come to believe that you must not judge people by the color of their skin or by their faith, but by their character. And he taught that all men were created equal, and the Stoics taught that true freedom is within you. No tyrant can take away your freedom. They cannot control your mind. And what you are truly free is in your mind, the thoughts that you take with that mind, and the actions you take based on those thoughts. So I can hold you in chains and be beating you, but you're free in your mind to forgive me. So, no, you are. And the right of conscience is your most fundamental right. The right to believe what you choose, and no one can force their beliefs upon you. So when the Congress sent forth to the states for ratification, and still today, Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion or the prohibiting the free exercise thereof, that means one thing and one thing only. Congress cannot establish, the United States Congress cannot establish a church, let's say the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, say that is the official church of the United States, and pay for it out of tax monies. England has an established church, correct? Germany has established churches. Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church are paid for out of state funds. That is all they meant. Now, secondly, prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Congress, nor the Supreme Court, can step in and tell you how to exercise your religion. The founders did not want anybody making you worship in the way that they chose, but they would defend to the death your right, the town of Yukon, to set up a nativity scene in front of your town hall. They would defend to the death the right of your children in your community to say the Lord's Prayer. For Congress or the Supreme Court to prohibit that is to prohibit your free exercise of religion. That is how far we have wandered from the true meaning of the First Amendment. It is an amendment for religion. And remember, I told you this. What does the Northwest Ordinance passed by this same Congress say? That liberty, morality, and education are essential to freedom, and they must be forever encouraged. So we discourage religion, and we also discourage morality. Now, whenever I say that schools ought to teach moral values, people will immediately raise their hand and say, yeah, but whose moral values are you going to teach? Well, I promise you, you could get a group of well-meaning Hindus, Muslims, Protestant, Catholics, Jewish people, sit down, and they would all agree on fundamental moral values like truth, like justice. The free speech and the freedom of the press. Now, what did Thomas Jefferson tell you about newspapers? If he had to choose between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, he would choose the newspapers. However, that is posited on the belief that the newspapers present the truth and all sides of a question. Now, I'll take one very basic way in which the freedom of the press is abused today. See, another thing we want to forget is the founders believed that for every right, there is a corresponding responsibility. We don't like that idea of responsibility. But because the press has the right to be free, it has the responsibility to be truthful. Anonymous sources. Who in here is an attorney? I won't call on you. There. Can you go into court with anonymous sources? Yes or no? No. How can the press use anonymous sources? That is just a license to make up things. So simply to make the press identify their sources would be a crucial step towards making the press responsible. The press has become so powerful that they can make or break any political figure in this country. Now, isn't that true? And I cannot imagine George Washington sitting on his seat before some Sunday news media commentator, worried he's going to say one word that will then be played out of context over and over again till he is finished. In fact, if they took the tone with Washington that they take with our most distinguished senators, he would have whipped them with a bullwhip. They weren't worthy to challenge to a duel, but he would have beaten them. And our right to assemble and peaceably to petition. I get worried when I see our politicians worried about the tea parties. Regardless of what you think about them, that is an expression of the most basic right to come together and say, we don't like these taxes. And if King George had listened to more of those assemblies, we would probably be speaking with an English accent. So that is that First Amendment. And it is there because it is the framework of all the amendments that follow. It is the framework and foundation of your individual freedom. The right to think what you want to say what you want to, and then to act upon it in a peaceful fashion. What is the Second Amendment? Well, how does it read? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free people, a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there is no clearer sentence in the English language. It is exactly what it says. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, period. Now, why did we come together in our first lecture and meet at Lexington? What were the British trying to do? To confiscate our weapons, telling us we could not keep cannons. The founders wanted it absolutely clear that the citizen can keep any weapon he or she wants to. The British had a Declaration of Rights. 1689, before King William and Queen Mary could accept the crown, they had to accept the authority of Parliament and issue a Declaration of Rights that went all the way back to Magna Carta, back to 1215, ensuring the fundamental rights of Englishmen. And one of these was the right to bear arms. But in the English Declaration of Rights, it read, an Englishman has the right to bear arms suited to his station. Our founders did not want that. Now, you're going to tell me two things, aren't you? One, oh, well, they meant the people as a whole. The nation as a whole, not you, not you, not you. Now, what is one of the first things I told you about this Constitution and the word people? It means individual every time. So the people is you, and you, and you. And what else are you going to tell me? Oh, well, that meant only if you had a militia. Well, the Constitution has an educative purpose. The founders were well aware of that. And it is telling you that a large standing army is a threat to your safety and your freedom. They believed you should have a militia. Who fought the battles at Lexington and Concord, at Bunker Hill, at Cowpens, at Yorktown? The militia. Who fought the War of 1812? Militia units. Who fought at Gettysburg? Militia units. Who fought as far up as the Spanish-American War? Militia units. The founders believed in a draft. And they believed that citizenship went hand in hand with the obligation to serve your country in the military. So that is the second way in which we have wandered so far away. And the founders would come back here and tell you the Roman Republic began to fail and lose its freedom when it created a professional army rather than having every citizen serve in a draft. I'll say, now you'll get mad at me, but I will just say, I think the best thing we could do for our younger people is everyone at the age of 18 do 2 years of military service. And there are no exemptions. That was the trouble the last time. There will be no exemptions. Men as well as women. People with moderate handicaps can serve very well in the modern army. They would come together from all over the country. They would learn patriotism. They would learn fundamental skills. They would learn a devotion to their country and what it stood for. They would learn about responsibility. And then at the end of those 2 years, they could receive a free college education at the state university of their choice that they could get into. And I'll tell you sometime how you could finance that. But that would be very much like the GI Bill reborn. So we changed the First Amendment around so much that it doesn't mean anything, correct? Yes or no? Yes. And we just have completely taken away the meaning of the Second Amendment. It would be much better simply to pass a constitutional amendment and say the Second Amendment is hereby repealed than to erode it in so many different ways. The Third Amendment, we don't take it very seriously, don't think about it very much. It's almost never invoked. What is the Third Amendment? You cannot quarter troops in your home except in time of war. Now why? Well, the original basis of this was that the British king, always being cheap, he wanted to tax but not pay for anything. These unfunded mandates, isn't what they're called? And one of his unfunded mandates was you had to put these soldiers up in your house so you didn't have to pay for barracks. Well, these soldiers also acted as spies. And this is the Third Amendment. If the founders could come back, James Madison could come back and talk to you, would say, we would be very concerned today about all the information that is collected on each and every one of us. We would be concerned about the government peering into every aspect of our lives. So that Third Amendment means that really the government, unless it proves it has a reason to look into your finances or to look into what library books you check out, then they should not do it. Government has to prove its case to exercise these powers. Now, the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, those deal with your fundamental legal liberties under the English common law. And they are the very body of your individual freedom as it is in the Constitution today. Preventing unwarranted searches. Your right to habeas corpus, what does that mean? You can't just be thrown in jail and left there. Attorney can come and demand that you be released. Your right not to self-indict yourself, to incriminate yourself. Time and time again, these refer to the common law. And the founders were determined that the common law would be the foundation of our legal individual freedoms. What do we mean by the common law? Now, who's an attorney? You are. Who else? Now, I just see some of you I know to be attorneys. Now, why not just raise your hand? It is the most noble profession. There were more attorneys at the Congressional Convention than any other profession. So who's an attorney? Stand up nobly and boldly. Good for you. What do we mean by the common law?
The laws developed by the courts in England by law and equity that were generally understood and were not statute.
Excellent. 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 See there? And we really should learn about the common law. There are two great systems of jurisprudence in the world today. One is Roman law. Goes right back to the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D. Found in the great Codex of Justinian, the emperor of the 6th century. And the other is the English common law. And it grew up and took special form under King Henry II from 1154 to 1189. And there were numerous codes and laws throughout his realm of England. He was king both of England with claims to the kingship of France, and he set out to create a common code of laws that would apply to the whole realm rather than to one individual county, like Surrey, for example. That was the common law. And it was based on the old law of the Angles and Saxons, those Germanic tribes who had settled England, turned it from Britannia into England, the land of the Angles. Now, Thomas Jefferson thought we owed so much to this Germanic Anglo-Saxon tradition of freedom that he wanted the Anglo-Saxon leaders, Horst and Hincks, to be on our seal. He wanted them in a ship with big swooping Viking horns, and he even designed it. So this went back to the early Germanic tradition of freedom, which included 1, your right to trial by jury; 2, your right to bear arms; 3, your home is your castle. The king cannot enter into it. And during the Watergate hearings, Herman Talmadge said, from Georgia, said, I still remember that the wind and rain may enter into the cottage of an Englishman, but the king in all his majesty may not. So your home is inviolable except with a correctly granted warrant. But most fundamental of all, Roman law says that the government is above the law. The emperor is above the law. And secondly, under Roman law, you are guilty until proven innocent. Well, there's a reason for that. The state wouldn't bring a case against you unless they had proper evidence. But under common law, the king himself is under the law. And you are innocent until proven guilty. That's why the founders believed it was so important that we keep this common law and the jury trial. They believed that the individual citizen was most likely to understand his or her freedom if they served on a jury. Now, most of us today try to get out of jury service, don't we? And lawyers have all kinds of means of circumventing the basic idea of a jury, which is just 12 good individuals to hear the truth, based on the idea that the ordinary person can recognize the truth. So those amendments are there to insist that we keep the common law. And the common law is very far away from laws made just by judges and by federal and state regulatory agencies. Those undermine that common law. Then the Ninth Amendment. People in these ratifying conventions around the country got very concerned that at some point the government might say, well, now since this is not spelled out in the Constitution, you don't have that right. So they said the fact that a right is not specifically stated in this Constitution or prohibited by it it is reserved to you. Every right that's not somehow limited by the Constitution belongs to the people. And then finally, the 10th Amendment, which started the Civil War, was what? Powers not specifically delegated to the United States by this Constitution, are prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Our Constitution begins with "we the people," and it ends with "the people." Because ultimately the founders insist that you are responsible. What did Benjamin Franklin tell the lady who asked him, do we have a monarchy or a republic? You have a republic if you can keep it. But the founders knew their Greek and Latin, they knew Plato and Aristotle, and they knew that a democracy, even one that was shielded by such a constitution, had a very strong tendency to grow ever more democratic. And by ever more democratic, they meant, one, the franchise will be ever more extended, and two, it will become a means for redistribution of the wealth. That is why Plato and Aristotle worried about a sweeping democracy. It was a means of taking from the wealthy to give to the poor. And if the poor had the majority of the votes, they would most assuredly take your money. Do you understand that? And distribute it among themselves. And without saying that this is right or wrong, historically, that has been the move of our Constitution towards ever greater democracy. And I think we can say that is a very fine thing. But if you follow the fundamental amendments, not ones that just somehow tinker with the date of the inauguration of a president, but the fundamental amendments, they are the 13th, 14th, and the 15th. The Civil War amendments. One, ending forever slavery. Two, ensuring that every citizen is first and foremost a citizen of the United States. And no state can pass a law that interferes with your life, liberty, or your property. A law that contravenes the law of the United States. And then granting the right to vote to African Americans, greatly broadening the franchise, and properly so. Then the next great political movement in our country, because after the Civil War, people kind of just sat back. You know, they wanted to make money, they had fought all these battles, business was very, very big and booming, and business basically bought up Congress. They made huge campaign contributions. That's when campaign contributions became the rule. Big corporations would say, we give, who's going to likely win that election, that Senate? The Democrats. All right, we'll give them 60% and give 40% to the Republicans just to cover our bases. John D. Rockefeller was said, why don't you go into politics and be a senator? He said, why? I own 30 of them. Why do I need to be one? And it was against this one, public apathy, that we really can't change anything. Two, ordinary people saying, we are not getting a square deal. There's one railroad that I have to use to get my crops to the market. That's what they said here in Oklahoma. That railroad charges me 10 times what is necessary. And then I have no control. My prices will drop down to 5 cents for a bale of cotton. And then there are these huge tariffs that make the goods that I buy 4 times more expensive than if we had free trade. So worry about taxes, worrying about their own economic situation, believing that the government had been taken over by big business, the people began to stand up. They didn't call them tea parties, they called them Granges. And they started in the Midwest, they came down to Oklahoma, they went down into the South. And there were people coming together and saying, wait a minute, it says we the people, we're the people. And there were men like Theodore Roosevelt, whose family was appalled that he was going to go into politics. Why proper young Harvard men don't go into politics, they live on their trust fund. Politics is dirty. And he went into it. And that was his ideal, to bring the government back to the people. And he was one of our most popular and greatest presidents. And where did some of his best support come from? Right here in the state of Oklahoma. Why, he read about a man who beat up wolves with his bare hands down in Oklahoma. And he said, I got to meet this man. And he went down there with him, and the two of them went out and beat up wolves with their bare hands. Panama Canal. He went down and helped run the bulldozers. And he led the first progressive movement. Now that term has various overtones today, but then it meant returning government to the people, regulating business in the interest of the ordinary person, in the interest of giving them a square deal. He called it the New Nationalism. Remember I told you, he said, I don't want to hear that you're an Italian American, a German American, a Greek American. I just want to hear that you're an American. And he said, our two great exemplars are George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Not only did they lead us to freedom, but they led us into war. Just and necessary wars. And so to him, World War I was a just and necessary war. And it was under the sweep of this progressive movement, which was also embraced by Woodrow Wilson, our most scholarly president, that the amendments were passed. One, directly electing senators. See, they had been appointed by state legislatures, and people believed that the state legislatures were utterly corrupt. So the people would elect the senators directly, and then secondly, what was the other one? An income tax, a graduated income tax. So expanding the franchise and giving the government essentially an unlimited power to tax. You're too young to remember this, but in the 1950s, what was the tax if you made over a certain amount of money? 90%. That was quite a little bite out of it, wasn't it? Yes. So essentially an unlimited power to tax. Those were the great reforms of the progressive era. Then World War I and two more reforms came out. What were they? One was prohibition, and one was giving women the right to vote. Now you could say, I wouldn't say that, but when all the real American boys were in France fighting for freedom, they took away their right to buy a beer. Correct? They came back home after serving in the trenches, and they couldn't get a shot of rye whiskey. And from the very beginning, the prohibition movement had been very tightly bound to the right of women to vote. It was believed that alcohol led to a great deal of domestic abuse. Business was behind it. It was believed that it led to a great deal of lost time from work. So these two were then passed in the aftermath of World War I. But wasn't it fair that the most intelligent half of our nation vote? Yes or no? The most intelligent and common sense minded people were now able to vote. So another enormous increase in the franchise, and once more government looking into aspects of your private life, correct? Trying to tell you what is moral and immoral. Well, fortunately, the Republicans were voted out of office, Franklin Roosevelt came in, and prohibition was repealed. And then the gradual continuing expansion of our franchise, until finally 18-year-olds were allowed to vote. The ultimate increase of the franchise. Was that fair? Yes. These boys who waded ashore at Guadalcanal. At Normandy, their average age was 19, telling me they can't vote when they can fight for their country. So that was one of our great amendments. So we now have a greatly extended franchise, an unlimited power to tax. So we have moved in the direction of a radical democracy. But it is still contained. It is still contained by the framework of this Constitution, your ability to amend it, your ability to set term limits by voting them out of office, correct? How many of you has a problem the way things going today? All right. But instead of just whining, call us back to these fundamental principles. And they are of limited government, low taxes, a strong government, but one that is held in check and limited by this miraculous Constitution. Now, what does it say up there? How can we reclaim our legacy of freedom? We will reclaim it when we become again the kind of men and women that stood at Lexington, that suffered at Valley Forge, that triumphed at Yorktown. We will regain that legacy of freedom when we become like the men who fought at Gettysburg, or the men who fought at Normandy, in Sicily, at Iwo Jima, the men who froze in Korea, who believed that this Constitution, this legacy of freedom, was worth any sacrifice, and put together themselves as patriots and elected leaders who embodied all that was best in America. We have too often had in recent years presidents who do not embody what is best in America. But this is still a nation of great and goodness. And there is out there a leader like a Lincoln, like a Washington, to bring us back to greatness. This great nation will endure as it has endured. It will revive, and it will prosper. Well, thank you for listening to me.